What is SQL Server? SQL Server is a relational database management system developed by Microsoft. As a database server, it is a software product with the primary function of storing and retrieving data as requested by other software applications which may either run on the same computer or on another computer across a network or the internet. SQL Server exclusively used to only run on a Windows-based environment, but for the past few years, Microsoft has made it also available to run on a Linux-based environment. The current version of SQL Server as of the time I'm recording this video is SQL Server 2019. In most production environments, SQL Server will be installed normally on a dedicated machine, and then users would log into that machine remotely from their own computer to access the databases that they want to use. You can also install SQL Server locally on your own computer. SQL Server can be used for different purposes apart from as a database server. Every server installation of SQL is referred to as an instance. So a single instance is a single installation of SQL Server which can hold many individual databases. In order to interact and communicate with the data stored in relational database management system, there is a special language called structural query language, which is used to interact with most relational database management system. Microsoft SQL Server has its own implementation of the SQL language, which is called Transact SQL, which is also referred to as T-SQL. Let's take a look at the hardware requirements. Let's start with the hard disk. The minimum size for the hard disk is 6 GB of disk space. However, the disk space requirements can vary depending on the SQL Server component you're going to install. There are different components, so if you're installing a lot of components, you will require much more than the minimum 6 GB of hard disk space. The required monitor is Super VGA with a resolution of 800 by 600 or higher. Next is the memory. The minimum required memory is 1 GB. However, memory of 4 GB and above is recommended to accommodate the databases. However, there are some SQL Server components that do require a lot of memory apart from the minimum recommended memory type. For example, if you're going to install the data quality server component, that takes about 2 GB of RAM, which is more than the recommended minimum memory. So memory can vary depending on what you are installing. The recommended processor speed is 1.4 GHz on a 64-bit processor. However, they have recommended 2.0 GHz or faster. The next component is the processor type. So I've listed out the requirements for the processor type here. The key thing to note is that SQL Server only supports 64-bit processor. It no longer supports 86-bit processor. Let's take a look at the software requirements. So software requirements are fairly basic. The software requirements, you should already have that on your system if you've already got a Windows operating system. So the operating system requirements: Windows 10, TH1 1507 or greater, Windows Server 2016 or greater. So make sure you have Windows 10 installed or Windows Server 2016 or greater. The .NET framework, you must have that on your system. So if you've got a Windows 10 operating system installed or a Windows Server 2016 or greater, you should have the .NET framework already installed with it. Also relating to the network software component, if you've also installed the Windows 10 or if you've got Windows Server 2016 or greater, you should have network protocols, shared memory, named pipes, and TCP/IP. You should have these pre-installed and available once you have the operating system already installed. An SQL Server installation is called an instance, and a single instance can hold many individual databases. An SQL Server can have different types of instances. The main types of instances are the database engine. This is the default instance, which is used basically to create and store data inside databases. And then we also have the analysis services, which can be used if you want to perform different analytic data type operations. And then we have what is called the integration services, which is mainly used for data warehousing, data extraction, and things like that. Also, if you want to produce reports, there is the reporting services. So these are different types of instances that SQL Server can be used for. To download SQL Server, we need to visit the link displayed on the screen. This is the official website for SQL Server 2019 download. So there are some options here to try SQL Server on premises or in the cloud. So if you want to try it on premises, this is the trial version. If you want to try it in the cloud, then you have the option to go to Azure. But what we want the developer edition, which is free. There's also an option to download the Express if you wish to do so. Also, if you want to install SQL Server 2019 on Windows, Linux, or Docker containers, it tells you the way to do that here. But we are going for the developer edition. So I'm going to click on this button link to download the setup file for the developer edition. So I'll click on that and that should start downloading. You can see here it started downloading the files for the developer setup. This should not take too long, so I'll just give it a few minutes to complete. The download has completed. This is just a partial download that will enable you to start the installation. So I'm just going to click on this to go to the download location. So I'll click show in folder, and this takes me to my folder where it was downloaded to. So this is what the file looks like. It says SQL 2019-SSE1-dev. You can see the size is not that much. This is just a partial installation. You still have to run this file to download the full installation files. When you download the installation files, it will prompt you for a default location. So I'm going to create a folder here where it's going to download the other components of the SQL Server installation. So I'm going to right click here in my downloads folder, go new, and I'm just going to click on folder. I'm just going to give it a name. I'm going to call it SQL Server download. So I've created this folder here inside my download file called SQL Server 2019 download. So now that I have that folder created, I want to run this file that I initially downloaded. So I'll double click to run, and that will start up the setup files for the installation. So you can see here it gives you three options. You have the basic, the custom, and download media. Download media basically enables you to download the files so that you can later just run it from your computer or any computer you want to run the installation from. I'm going to go for the download media so that I have the option to install it later, or if, for example, something goes wrong with my machine and I have the copy saved, I can install it in a different machine. So I'm going to go for the download media option. I'm going to accept the default package. So you have two options of packages you would like to download, either the ISO or the CAB. So I'm going to leave the default, which is the ISO. I'm going to browse to my downloads folder and just select the folder I created to download it into. So I browse to my downloads folder, and this is the folder called SQL Server. I'm just going to click OK. And you can see here on the select download location is now selected the folder I created. So it's going to download it into that. So once that's selected, I'm just going to click download for the download to begin. The download of SQL Server 2019 Developer Edition is now complete. So I'm just going to close this box here. It says, are you sure you want to exit? I'll say yes. I'm going to open up the folder that I downloaded the SQL Server 2019 into. So I'll double click to open it. You can see here it is a disk image file. So I'm just going to double click to open the content. So these are the content. So to begin the installation, I'm just going to double click on this setup file here to run it, and that should start the installation. This is the initial screen you get when you try to install SQL Server, and on the left here it gives you the different steps that the installation is going to take. So the first step is basically the planning, where you just check to make sure that you've got the right hardware and software. If you want to do that, you can just click on this link here to take you to the hardware and software requirements. And there are different documentation as well, security documentation. If you want to read through it, you can. Now there is an important tool here which is called System Configuration Checker. If you run this tool, it will check to make sure that your system is ready to install SQL Server 2019. So I'm going to click to run this checker, and that will quickly run through my system and tell me if my system is ready or not. You can see here it says the operation is completed. I have passed 8. So it ran 8 checks and I've passed it. If you want to see the details, just click show details and it will tell you everything it has checked, and you can see here the status is passed. If yours does not pass, or if it has a warning, it usually will give you a guide as to how to resolve that. So I'm just going to click OK to close this. So now I know my system is ready for the installation because I have passed all the hardware and software requirements. Next, I'm going to move on to the installation stage. Inside the installation page, we have the option here to install new SQL Server, standalone installation, or add features to an existing installation. So if you already have SQL Server installed and you want to add features to the existing installation, you can still use this link. But I am installing a single instance of SQL Server, so I'm going to click on that, and that will launch the installation wizard. So this is the installation wizard. The first thing it'll ask is for a product key. It has detected that I'm running a developer edition, so I don't need a product key. If you were not running developer, you will normally have to put in your product key there. So I'm going to accept and click next, and that will give me the next screen here. So I'm just going to check this box to accept the license agreement. You can see these are the various steps. I'm on step number 2, license terms, that I'm going to go through to complete the installation. So I'll click on next, and it will do some basic checks. It will install some set of files. So I'll just wait for it to finish. On this step of the installation here, I've had some checks here. It says I've passed 3 and failed 0. You can see here the one that I have a warning on. So it's just a warning about the firewall. This is not serious. It's not a showstopper. It will not stop the installation from progressing. If you want to see what it says, you can click on the warning thing here, and it just tells you what that says. So I'm going to click next to progress to the next stage of the installation. The next step is you are provided with this feature selection, so that you select the component you want to install for this instance. In this case, I only want to install the database engine services, so I'm going to check that. That is the only thing I'm going to check. There are other things you can include as well. If you look on the right here, it gives you the feature description, tells you what it is, what it does. It tells you some prerequisites for the selected feature. Tells me here already installed. So if you want to install other things like machine learning and stuff like that, analysis services, you can always install it. You can also come back to add features once you've installed SQL Server. So I'm going to leave just the database engine services checked for now. And then you have the instance. It tells you this is where it's going to install it, in the root of C program files, Microsoft SQL Server. And it tells you this is a shared feature directory. So I'm going to just click on next. If you, for example, want to install all the features, you can click on this button and that will select all the features. But before you do that, make sure you do have sufficient disk space. So with the database engine services checked, I'm going to click next to progress to the next step of the installation. The next step is to give your instance a name. So this is the instance configuration. The default name for the instance is called MS SQL Server. I'm going to change that. I'm going to give it my own name. I'm going to call it SQL Server 2019. The name you give your instance is also used as the instance ID. So I've given my name instance SQL Server 2019. The instance ID is also going to change to reflect that. All right, you can see it has changed. So I'm going to click next to progress to the next step, which is server configuration. So it's doing the instance configuration now. And once that is done, we've moved on now to the server configuration. So I'm just going to accept all the default that is there and click on next to move to the next step. So I'm going to click next to progress to the next stage. We are now on the database engine configuration page, where you have to set the method of authentication to the SQL Server. The default is Windows authentication mode, which means whatever way you log into your computer, that will be used also to connect to the server. I'm going to select mixed mode, which is a mixture of the Windows authentication and a SQL Server mode, but you have to provide a password to accommodate the SQL Server mode. Once you have entered the password and confirmed the password, you also need to add a user that has administrative rights. So I'm going to click on this button that says add current user. I'll click on that. You can see that has added the username I used to log on to this computer, which is administrator. So once that's been entered and we've entered the password for the SQL Server System Administration account, which is called the SA account, click on next. It then gives you a summary before it actually progresses with the installation. It tells you here ready to install. You can see here I've got 2 more steps, so feel free to read through the summary. If there's anything that's not right, you can change it before you progress. So I'm happy with everything. I'm going to click on install. It also tells you here the configuration file path. So I'm going to click install, and that will begin the installation. You can see it says installation in progress. So I've gone through all the steps. I've got just 1 more step to complete. The installation is now complete. You can see it says your SQL Server 2019 installations completed successfully with product updates. So you can see here status says succeeded and tells you all the features it has installed. It installed the database engine services, SQL browser, SQL writer, SQL client connectivity, SDK, SQL client connectivity. So these are all the features that it has installed with the database engine services. So I'm just going to click on this close button here to exit the installation screen and also exit this screen too. The next thing to do is to check for SQL Server in my programs menu. So I'm going to click on start, and on the start here there should be a folder for Microsoft SQL Server. You can see here it says new Microsoft SQL Server 2019. If I expand that, you can see here it tells me these are all the things it has installed. So these tools are quite useful. We've got the SQL Server 2019 Configuration Manager, SQL Server 2019 Error Usage, SQL Server 2019 Import Export, SQL Server 2019 Installation Center. So these are very useful tools that will come in handy if you want to perform configuration or import stuff and also add additional features to your installation of SQL Server. What is SQL Server Management Studio? SQL Server Management Studio is also referred to as SSMS. SQL Server Management Studio is an integrated development environment which provides a graphical interface for connecting and working with Microsoft SQL Server. SQL Server Management Studio is a free tool provided by Microsoft to manage SQL servers. SQL Server Management Studio is used by professional developers and database administrators to manage and administer SQL servers. SQL Server Management Studio can be used to access, to configure, to manage, to administer, and develop all components of SQL Server. Let's go ahead and download and then install SQL Server Management Studio. To download SQL Server Management Studio, we're going to go to our Programs menu and look for the SQL Server 2019 folder, and inside that folder we should have a tool. So we've got Microsoft SQL Server 2019. I'm going to expand that, and we have this tool here that says SQL Server 2019 Installation Center. So if I click on that, it will launch the installation screen, and then from there we can download the SQL Server Management Studio. So this is the SQL Server Installation Center, which allows you to add components to a previously installed SQL Server instance. So I'm going to click on this installation tab here, and within the installation tab, I'm going to click on the option that says Install SQL Server Management Tools. So if I click on this, it's going to take me to the download page where I can download it. So I'm going to click on that, and that will take me to the site that will enable me to download the SQL Server Management Studio. So it's trying to launch the site. So this is where it's going to take you. So I'm just going to scroll down, and you can see here there is a download link to download SQL Server Management Studio. It tells you the release number, the build number, release date. So I'm going to click to begin the download. You can see here the download has started here. So I'm just going to wait for it to complete, and then I will run the installation files. The download has completed. So this is the downloaded file. So I'm just going to click to show in folder, and that would take me to the location where it's downloaded it. So this is the downloaded file. This is the location where the SQL Server Management Studio setup file was downloaded to. So I'm just going to double click on it to start to install it. So I'll double click, and that should bring up the installation page. So I'll give it a few minutes to load that page. So you can see here it's loaded the page and tells me the location. This is where it's going to install it, and there is an option to change the location if you're not happy with it, but I would recommend you accept the default location and then just click on this option to install. So I'll click on the install button to progress the installation. The time it takes to install depends on your internet connection speed and the processing speed for your computer. The setup has completed for the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. So I'm just going to click on the close button to exit. So if we go back into the start menu and locate the SQL Server folder, mine is called SQL Server 2019. So this is the folder. If I expand this, I should see a new component. You can see here it says Microsoft SQL Server Tools. If I expand that, we should see different tools that the SQL Server tools installed: analysis services, deployment, database engine tuning, and this is the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. So if we want to interact with the SQL Server and log into it, we'll use the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. We are going to connect to Microsoft SQL Server using SQL Server Management Studio. Let's open up the SQL Server Management Studio. So I'll click on Start and look for my SQL Server 2019 folder, and the SQL Server Management Studio should be in there. So this is my Microsoft SQL Server 2019 folder. I'm going to expand it, and inside there we've got Microsoft SQL Server Tools 18. So I'm going to expand that, and inside there we have the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. So I'm going to right click and pin that to the start so that I have access to it each time I click on the start menu. So I'm going to double click to launch the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. If this is the first time you're launching the SQL Server Management Studio, it might take a while to launch. When the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio launches, this is the screen you'll see, and it gives you the option to connect to the server. So it has different options here. The first is the server type. So in this drop down here, there are different server type depending on the component you would have installed. I installed just the database engine, so that's the server type I'm going to connect to. If you have the others installed as well, these components, analysis services, reporting services, or integration services, if you have these components installed, you can also select them as the server type to log into. Next, it's the server name. So because I've got SQL Server installed on my local computer, This is the name. So this is the name of my local computer, and this SQL Server 2019 is the name of my SQL Server instance. If for any reason your server name does not show up, there is a drop down here where you can browse for more. If you go to browse option, and if you click, there's a local server and there's a network. If you're in a network environment, then you click on network servers, but I'm in a local environment. So inside the local environment, you can see I've got database engine, which is the instance I installed. If I expand the plus sign here, you can see here, this is the full path of my server. That's my computer name. And this SQL Server 2019 is the instance name. So my computer has automatically detected the server name, so I don't need to add that. But if for any reason your server name is not populated, that is how you populate it. Next is the authentication. By default, you can use the Windows authentication to log into SQL Server. You can see here my username is grayed out and the password is grayed out. That's because I'm already logged into my computer. So SQL Server uses the same credentials to connect to the SQL Server instance. If I do not want to use the Windows authentication, there's a drop down here. If I want to choose the SQL Server authentication, then I will have to supply the login name, which is SA, and then the password, which I would have supplied during the installation of SQL Server. But I'm going to change it to Windows authentication. And then before I click on the connect button, there is an options tab here. I just want to show you. You don't really need to change anything here, but if you're in a network environment, your network administrators might change some configurations here or might want you to change it. But for the purpose of this video, and because we're in a local environment, there is no need to change anything. So if I click on this options tab again, it takes me back to the SQL Server connection button. So now I've got all my details in, the server name is in. I can now click on the connect button to connect to the SQL Server. So I give it a few minutes to connect. You can see it has connected to SQL Server. This area here is called the Object Explorer. The Object Explorer provides a user interface that is kind of like a tree view structure that you can use to manage the objects in each instance of an SQL Server. You can also expand the pane, just drag it along. So you can see here, I've got some details highlighted here. We've got the name of the computer where the instance of the SQL Server is installed. And this is the name of the instance, SQL Server 2019. This is the version number, 15.0. And then we have the account that is logged in to the server, which is the administrator account for the local computer. You can connect multiple SQL Server instances and they will stack up here against each other. So if I wanted to connect to the same instance but using a different account, I can do that. So here, this icon here that says Connect Object Explorer, I can click on that and I can connect using the SQL Server authentication. So I click on the drop down, I select SQL Server authentication, and the username for that is called SA, and the password would have been the password I provided during the installation of SQL Server. I've entered the password. I can just click connect. You can see here is connected to another instance but with a different account. You can see here it tells me the account I've connected with, which is the SA account. It gives me the version number of SQL Server, the instance, and then the machine on which it is installed on. As you can see, it is possible to connect to multiple instances of an SQL Server. So to disconnect from a particular instance, while the instance is highlighted, there is an option here to disconnect. I just click on it and that will disconnect from the instance. If you want to disconnect to all your instances, you can just click on this icon here that says disconnect. That will disconnect from your instance. And then to exit the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, you just click on File, and there's an option here to exit. What is SQL? SQL stands for Structured Query Language. It is also referred to as SQL by tech professionals. SQL is the standard language that is used to communicate, access, manipulate, and interact with various types of databases. SQL became a standard of the American National Standards Institute in 1986. It also became a standard of the International Organization for Standardization in 1987. SQL has different versions that is implemented by various relational database management systems. For example, Microsoft SQL Server's version is called Transact SQL, or T-SQL for short. SQL versions, regardless of the version, must be compliant with the ANSI standard. SQL versions must be compliant with the ANSI standard in that they all have to support at least the major commands in SQL, such as select, update, delete, insert, where, in similar manner. Most relational database management systems have their own proprietary extensions in addition to the SQL standard. There are different things you can do with SQL. Let's take a look at some of the things that you can do with SQL. You can execute queries against a database. A query basically is a request for data or information from a database. You can retrieve data from a database. You can insert record in a database. You can update records in a database. You can delete records from a database. You can create new databases. You can create new tables in a database. You can create stored procedures in a database. A stored procedure is a prepared SQL code that you can save so the code can be reused over and over again. You can create views in a database. A view is a virtual table that is based on the result set of an SQL statement. You can also set permissions on tables, on procedures, and views. What is T-SQL? T-SQL stands for Transact SQL or Transact SQL. This is Microsoft SQL Server's implementation of the standard SQL language. Most developers and programmers refer to T-SQL as T-SQL. T-SQL has its own proprietary extensions in addition to the standard SQL language. T-SQL can be used to perform various types of actions on a Microsoft SQL Server database. It can be used to create new databases, tables, and other objects. T-SQL can be used to add user accounts, to modify, and also to manage access permissions. T-SQL can be used to run various types of maintenance tasks on an SQL server, can be used to query database. This will include retrieving data from a database, inserting records into a database, updating records in a database, deleting records from a database. CRUD basically is an acronym that stands for create, read, update, and delete. So these are the 4 basic operations that are mostly performed on a database system. So you create objects on the database, and the objects could include databases and tables, and then you can also read from that database. So you can retrieve and read the records from that database. You can also update existing records inside a database and also delete records inside a database. CRUD is the most popular and most common basic operations that you will perform on any database system. We are going to create a new database using T-SQL. To create a new database using T-SQL, we need to open up the query editor. So in the menu bar, click on New Query, and that will open up this query editor. I want to have line numbers inside my query editor. So to enable that, I go to the menus option, I click on Tools, and then go to Options, and within the options, select the option for Text Editor. Under the text editor, select all languages, and within all languages we have an option here that says line numbers. So just click to check that box and click OK, and then you can see I now have line number. So you can see the very first line is line number 1. To create a database, we are going to use the create database statement. On line number 1 here, I've added the statement that will create a new database. So the statement is create space database. You do a space and then you specify the name of your database. The database must be unique, so you cannot have 2 databases with the same name. Also, the database name has to have a maximum of 128 characters. When creating a new database, the only required parameter is the name of the database. So I've specified the name here, and then you have the semicolon, which indicates to SQL Server that that is the end of the statement. Once you've given your database a name, you need to execute the query so that the name gets displayed inside the databases folder. So there is an option here on the menu to execute the query. If you want to do it via your keyboard, you can just press F5 on your keyboard and that will do the same thing. So I'm going to click on this execute button and that will execute the query. You can see here it says command completed successfully. It tells you the time it took to do that, and it also tells you that it has created a new database. To see the database listed, you need to go to your databases folder, just right click, and there is an option to refresh. And then if you expand the databases folder, you can see here this is the name of the new database we have just created. We are going to create a new table using T-SQL. I am going to walk you through the commands I have inside the query editor. Line number 1, I've got the use space your DB. This your DB is the name of the database I want to create a table into. So you can either specify it, or if you look in the toolbar here, there is a drop down that gives you a list of all your databases. So I can either select it from here. If I select it from here, I can exclude that or leave it. It doesn't make any difference. But sometimes you may forget to change the database here in the menu. So by specifying the database inside the query editor will use whatever database you have specified inside the query editor. On line number 2, I've got the Go keyword. The Go keyword is optional if you only have a single command like I have here on line number 1. The Go keyword basically is used to separate different commands and then send them all to the SQL Server as a single batch. So that is optional if you have just one line of statement like I have on line number 1. And then line number 5 to line number 10 is what is going to actually create the table inside the database I have specified. To create a new table in a database, you specify the statement create on line number 5 space table, and then you specify dbo dot products. Products is the name of the table. DBO is what is called a schema. A schema is the account that owns that particular table. If you are using an administrator account, then you'll be using the default schema, which is DBO. DBO stands for database owner. Line number 6 to line number 9 is where you add the various columns for that table. You have to enclose them inside parentheses. The opening parentheses is on line number 6. The closing parentheses is on line number 9. So line number 6, the first column is called product ID, and the data type is integer. Is going to be the primary key column for the table, and then we've got not null, which means the column will not accept null or empty values. Line number 7 is the second column, which is called product name. Data type is varchar 25, which means it will allow up to 25 characters for that product name. And this is not null, which means it will not accept null values. Line number 8, the column name is price. Data type is money. And then we have null, which means it will allow null or empty values. Line number 8, name of the column is product description. Data type is varchar max. Max basically is a function, which means it will allow maximum character length of 8,000 characters. Null means it will accept null values. Notice that on each line here, we've got a comma, which separates each of the columns from the other columns. The line number 9 here, which is the final column, you don't need to add a comma. And then we close the parentheses, which means we have all the columns specified for this table. Line number 10 is just the Go keyword. When you're done, there's an execute button. Just click execute, or you can press F5 on your keyboard, and that will create the new table. If you take a look at your database, if I expand my database here, if I expand the tables folder here, you should see the new table. If I right click and refresh, sometimes it doesn't show up unless you refresh. You can see here, this is a new table I have just created. If I expand that, take a look at the columns, you can see the columns created for that table. You can also save your scripts that you have added inside the query window. An SQL script is basically a set of SQL commands that is saved as a file with a script extension. All right, and a script can contain one or multiple SQL statements. So I'm going to save this script. So I'll click on File, and there is an option to save SQL query. I'm going to save that. You can change the name, but make sure that the extension stays as SQL. So just change the name to an appropriate name. I am saving this script into a folder on my desktop called scripts. So I just click on save, and that will save the script. I'm just going to exit, and this green strip here basically means that I've got the content of this query editor saved. If the content is not saved, you have a yellow line here. So I can now exit the query window. I'll be showing you how to insert data into a table using T-SQL. I have opened up a new query window, and I've added some SQL commands that I'm going to use to insert multiple records into the database table. So on line number 1, I'm specifying the database I want to use, and the name of my database is called YourDB. Line number 3 is the statement that you use to insert data into a table. So you type in insert space into, and then you type in the name of the table you want to insert data into. So you don't have to use the DBO prefix. This is optional. DBO basically means database owner. So you can leave that option out if you want to. It is not mandatory. As long as you have specified the name of the database you want to use, that should be sufficient. Once you have specified the name of the table you want to insert the new records into, in parentheses you specify the name of the columns for that table, and then you separate each column by a comma. So first column is product ID, comma, next column product name, comma, next column is the price, you do a comma, and the final column for that table is called product description, and then you close the parentheses. When you specify the columns, you also have to specify the values that will go into each column. So line number 5 here, we're specifying the values. So this values keyword will represent which value goes into each of the column. So you can insert multiple records into a database table like I'm doing here. I'm going to insert 3 records, or you can insert 1 record at a time, doesn't really matter. So line number 7, I specify inside parentheses, you have to enclose each of the values that will go into each column. It's very important that the right value goes into the respective column in the order the columns have been specified. When you are specifying the values that will go into each column, make sure that the values will represent the column that is going into. For example, the first column here is product ID, line number 7. So that number 1 here will go into product ID. Clamp here will go into the column called product name, and then this 12.48 will go into the price column, and this workbench clamp will go into the product description. So the values have to correspond to the way the columns have been specified in the insert into statement. Okay, so we have a comma here after line number 7. So that's the end of the first record. So record number 2 starts on line number 8. So 2 here again goes into the product ID. Screwdriver goes into product name. $7.99 goes into product price, and then this flathead goes into the product description. And then on line number 9 here, same thing, 3 goes into product ID and so on. So the key thing to remember is that when you specify your values, they must correspond to the way the product columns have been specified. For example, I cannot specify product ID as the first column and then have this clamp as the first value. It will not work. So the values have to correspond to the way the columns have been specified. When you're done, just click on the execute command to execute the query. You can see it tells you 3 rows affected. So that means it has inserted 3 rows into the database table. So if I expand my databases and go to the database called your DB, if I expand the tables here and click on this table, if I right click and select top 1000 rows, it will display the rows. You can see here I've only got 3 rows or 3 records inside the table which the query has returned. I have opened up a new query window and added some T-SQL commands that I'm going to use to query or read data from my database table. So I'm going to run through the commands with you. On line number 1 here, I've got a comment. This is a single line comment. So comments are just used to describe your code or your queries. It does not get executed when the script or the code is executed. So line number 1 is basically a comment. Line number 3, I'm specifying what database I'm going to use. So that's the database that contains my table. So you can either specify it here, as I've done on line number 3, or you can use the drop-down menu here and select your database from the drop-down menu. To read or query data from your database table, you use the select statement. On line number 5, I've got the keyword select, which is the key word you use to read or query data that is stored inside a database table. So after the select keyword, you specify the names of the columns that contain the data you want to read from. So here I specified all the columns that I have in the table called products. So line 5, after the select keyword, you specify the columns you want to read the data from, and each column is separated by a comma. Line number 6, you use the from keyword to specify the name of the table where the columns are located. When you're done, you just press the execute button here on the menu bar, and that will query the database. You can see it has returned all the records that are stored in that table. Another way to read or query data from all the columns stored inside your database table is to specify the statement on line number 10. So you just type in select asterisk. The asterisk means you want to read data or return data from all the columns in a particular table. So line number 10, I'm saying select star, which means all the columns from the table called products. And then if I execute that, you can see I've got the same query. To comment out a block of statements, you just do the slash asterisk and then the asterisk slash. So you can see here, all this block here have turned green because I have commented out that block. So when the code is executed, the block in green, which is comments, are excluded. When you query or read data from a database table, the result of the query, which is this down here, is referred to as a result set. You can also select specific columns from your database table to query data from. So line number 12 here, I'm using the select statement to query just two columns from the table, the product name and the price. And then line 13 is where we specify the name of the table we are retrieving or querying the data from. Notice line number 10 has been commented out. So when I execute the query inside the query editor, line number 10 will not execute. So to execute, I'm just going to click the execute button. You can see here it has returned only two columns, the product name and the price. All right, so you can select specific columns to query data from inside your database tables. I have added another block of code here, and this query is going to query the database and return data based on a condition. So line number 19 here, I'm using the select keyword to select two columns from the database table, the product name and the price. Line 20 is where we specify the table that contains the columns we have specified. Name of the table is product. Line 21, we're using the where clause. The where clause is used to limit the rows or the records that are returned from the result of the query based on the condition you have set. So I'm saying return the data based on this condition where the price is less than 11. So you can see here in the previous query, we've got three price range, 12.48, 7.99, 10.99. With the condition I have set, only two prices will meet that condition. So if I execute the query, you can see I've only got two records returned, which has met the condition I set on the where clause. Let's begin by opening up a new query window. So in the menu bar here, I'm going to click new query. And then the very first thing I want to do is query the database table I want to update or modify. I have added some commands here. Line number 1, I'm specifying the database I want to use. You can also specify the database here from this drop down. So even though I don't select the database from here, as long as I have it specified here inside the query editor, it will execute the query against the database I have specified in the query editor. Line number 3, I'm using the select statement to query all the columns from this table called products. So I'm going to execute. So these are all the records from the table called products. It's always a good idea to take a look at the table before you make any modifications. I want to modify record number 2. I want to change the product name from screwdriver to flathead screwdriver. So I want to include flathead in the product name for screwdriver. I have added a block of code here. So this query here is going to be used to update the record from my database table. So I'm going to run through the query with you. Line number 5, you use the update keyword. You use that to modify existing records in a database table. So you don't have to specify DBO. DBO basically is the owner of the database. So you can actually omit that. That is not mandatory. As long as you have the name of the database specified, then you should be good to go. So once you specify the name of the table you want to update, I've done that on line number 5. Line number 6, you use the set keyword to set a new value. So I'm using the set, and the column I want to modify is the product name column. You use the equals to assign a new value to that product name column. So I've given it a new value, flathead screwdriver. Line number 7 is very, very important. When you're updating records from a table, whether you're updating one record or you're updating thousands of records, you must add the where clause. The where clause is used as a safety guard to prevent all the records from your database table being updated with the same value. So where here, I'm using that to specify that this is where I want the modification to take place, where the product ID is 2. You can see here my product ID is set to 2. So it will only update the record that matches that criteria. Okay, so if I execute the query, you can see it says 1 row affected. If I try to run a select statement again, you should see the modifications. I've commented out this block of code so that it doesn't run, and I'm going to remove the comment from the code on line number 3. So line number 3, we just run a select statement. So I click execute, and you can see here line number 2 here, product ID 2 has now been changed to flathead screwdriver. So the update statement is what you use to update records that you already have stored in your database table. One of the tasks to perform on a database is the deletion of records. So I'm going to show you how to do that. To begin, I'm going to open up the query editor. So I'll click on the new query here to open up the query editor. Before you delete any record from your database table, it's always a good idea to take a look at the records before the deletion. So on line number 3, I'm using the select statement to retrieve all the records from the database table called products. Line number 1 is just specifying the database that contains the table I want to retrieve data from. I'm going to execute this query so that I can take a look at what's inside. So this is what the database table contains. I want to delete record number 4 from this database table called products. I have added the query that I'm going to use to delete a single record from my database table. I have commented out the code here on line number 3. I don't want this statement to run when I execute the queries inside my query editor. So line number 5, to delete a record from a table, you type in delete space and then from. The from is where you specify the name of the table that contains the data you want to delete. Line number 6, I've got the where clause. Now this is very, very important, because if you don't specify the condition inside the where clause, it will delete every record in the table. The where clause is acting as a filter or as a guard so that you only delete the record that meets the conditions specified inside the where clause. So in the where clause, I'm saying I only want to delete the record whose product ID is equals to 4. So you can see on the bottom here, the product ID of 4 is going to be this record here that contains the product name called BLS car battery. So that record is going to be deleted because it matches the condition I have set or provided in the where clause. If you don't specify a condition in the where clause, all the records in the table gets deleted. So it's very important you do that. So I'm going to execute the query. Just click execute. You can see it says 1 row affected. So I'm going to just uncomment the block on line number 3, and I'm just going to highlight it so that only this line I've highlighted is going to execute. So I click execute, and you can see here it has executed, and record with product ID 4 is no longer in the database table. Truncating a database table basically means removing all the records or data from that table. Before I truncate the table I want to truncate, I want to see the records inside the table. Line number 1, I am specifying the database I want to use, which contains the table I want to truncate. Line number 3, I'm just going to run this select statement to see what data I have inside the table called products. To execute the statement on line number 3, I'll click execute, and you can see here this table has 3 records. So when I truncate the table, it will delete all the records, but it will leave the structure of the table intact. So it will leave the names of the columns, but there will be no rows or records. To truncate the table, I've added this statement on line number 6, truncate space table, and then you specify the name of the table. The name of the table I want to truncate is called products. I have commented out the statement on line number 3 because I don't want it to run when I execute this query inside the query editor. So to truncate the table, I just click execute, and you can see it says the command completed successfully. So I want to run the select statement again. So I'm just going to remove the comment from the statement on line number 3. I'm going to select it and then execute so that we can see. You see now after the truncation, all I have is the table structure, which includes just the columns of the table, but all the records have been truncated or deleted from that table. So that's how you truncate a database table. I'll be showing you how to drop a database table. Dropping a table basically means deleting a table. Before you drop a database table, you have to be careful. You need to make sure that that table is not being referenced by other tables within your database. Before dropping the table, I just want to run a quick select statement to see if I have any data in the table. So line number 3 here is the select statement. I'm going to execute, and you can see there is no data in this table. The table has been truncated. I also know that this table is not being referenced by other tables within my database. To drop a database table, you type in the statement on line number 5 here, drop space table, and then you specify the name of the table, and that should drop the table from the database. I have commented out the statement on line number 3 so that that statement does not run when I execute the queries inside the query editor. So I'm going to click to execute. It tells me the command completed successfully. I have removed the comment from the statement on line number 3. If I try to run this statement, it will tell me that that table does not exist. So if I click execute, you can see it tells me invalid object name products. That's because I have deleted or dropped the table. Dropping a database means deleting a database. So you have to be careful before you drop a database. Deleting a database will also result in the loss of all the information you have stored inside that database. So all the tables you have in that database will also be deleted. To drop a database, you have to use the drop database statement, which I have specified on line number 1. So drop space database space the name of the database you are dropping. Notice here, because I'm dropping this database, I haven't got the database in use. In the database list here, I've got the master database selected. You cannot drop a database if you have the database actively selected. So in my database list here, I've got master selected, so that should enable me to drop my database called YourDB. So I click to execute, and it tells me here the command completed successfully. If I right click on my database folder and I click to refresh, if I go into my database list, that database called YourDB, you can see it is no longer listed in my database list. Also, in the drop down for my databases, you can see that database called YourDB is not listed anymore. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.